I pretended to support my brother's wedding to his gold digger fiancée, then planted the evidence at the altar. My brother, Jake, had always been the golden boy, a star athlete, an honor student, the first one out of college when he brought Meredith home for Christmas. My parents had practically started planning the wedding before dessert had even been served. "She's perfect for him," my mom would gush, watching Meredith laugh at my dad's terrible jokes. Finally, someone who appreciates what a great match he is. I wanted to believe it. Jake deserved to be happy after his bad divorce from Sarah, who emptied their joint accounts and disappeared with her yoga instructor. He'd spent 2 years rebuilding his life, working 16-hour days and avoiding relationships entirely. The betrayal gutted him. I found him crying in his empty apartment, surrounded by legal papers and divorce papers, wondering what he'd done wrong. "I gave her everything I had," he said that night. "I thought we were building a life together." When he finally started dating again, we all desperately wanted him to find someone genuine, someone who would see past his success to the man inside. A guy who still sent our mom flowers on her birthday, who coached Little League on the weekends, who drove 14 hours straight when our cousin was in a car accident. But something was wrong with Meredith from the moment she walked through our door. She was beautiful and charming and said all the right things. Too right. It was as if she rehearsed every conversation. When Jake left the room to get drinks or use the restroom, her smile would disappear for a moment before reappearing. She studied the family photos on our mantle with an intensity that made my skin crawl, asking detailed questions about every face, every vacation, every milestone. "Who is that distinguished gentleman?" she'd ask, pointing to a portrait of our grandfather. "He looks so successful. What business was he in?" "Real estate development?" Mom would answer proudly. "He built half the malls in town." I watched Meredith's eyes light up as she recorded yet another piece of financial information. The red flags had started small but quickly multiplied. Meredith always had an excuse when the bill arrived at restaurants. "Oh, I forgot my wallet again." She'd order the most expensive dish on the menu, lobster, steak, premium cocktails, and then claim she wasn't very hungry after eating half. Jake would laugh it off and pay for everything, plus leave a generous tip to make up for her barely touched dishes. "She's just forgetful," he'd say when I mentioned her convenient amnesia. "And she's been stressed out about work lately. You know how demanding marketing can be." Her job was another mystery, one that became more confusing the more I looked. She claimed to work in marketing for a tech startup called Digital Dynamics, but her schedule was completely random. Sometimes she had urgent client meetings at 11 p.m. on Sundays. Other times, she was completely free all day on a busy Wednesday. When I asked about the name of her company or what products it promoted, she gave vague answers about digital solutions and business process optimization, then quickly changed the subject. "You know how these tech companies are," she said with a dismissive gesture. "It's all proprietary and confidential. I've signed so many non-disclosure agreements I can barely talk about what I had for lunch." I tried to find Digital Dynamics online. No website, no LinkedIn page, no business registration that I could find. When I mentioned this to Jake, he became defensive. "Not every company has a huge online presence," he said. "Some companies prefer to keep a low profile. You're being paranoid." But the paranoia seemed justified when I began to notice other inconsistencies. Meredith claimed to live in an apartment downtown, but I'd never seen her car parked there when I drove by. She said she was from Oregon, but her accent sometimes shifted, hinting at something more southern. She knew details about our family that Jake swore he'd never told her. "How do you know our grandmother's middle name?" I asked her once when she casually mentioned it. "Jake told me," she replied, without batting an eye. But when I asked Jake later, he looked confused. "I never told anyone Grandma's middle name. Hell, I barely remember it myself." The turning point came at Easter dinner when I overheard her talking on the phone in our guest bathroom. I'd gone upstairs to get an aspirin from the medicine cabinet when I heard her whispering in a rush behind a closed door. "The wedding has to happen before his grandmother dies," she hissed into the phone. "That inheritance won't pass unless we're married. The lawyers were very clear about the prenuptial agreement. Just keep pretending to be sick until then, and we'll split the whole thing 60-40, like we discussed." My blood ran cold. Jake's grandmother had been battling pancreatic cancer for months, growing weaker with each chemotherapy session. The family business, a successful chain of hardware stores built over 3 generations, and the family estate were to pass to Jake upon her death, but only if he was married. An archaic clause from the 1940s that everyone had forgotten except the probate lawyers who brought it up during a recent will review. Only Meredith somehow knew. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart pounding as she continued, "I don't care what you do. Delay the diagnosis, lose the paperwork, give her the wrong medication, whatever it takes to keep her alive long enough for me to get that ring on my finger. We need at least 6 weeks. Once we're married," the old woman added hoarsely, "I'll divorce him and we'll be set for life. The business alone is worth $2 million, plus the real estate portfolio." The voice on the other end was muffled, but I heard enough to know that this had been planned, orchestrated. My brother was being systematically destroyed by someone he trusted completely, and our grandmother was apparently being kept sick to fit Meredith's schedule. "Make sure the next round of chemo is especially tough," she went on. "I need her weak enough that no one will ask questions when she finally dies, but not so weak that she dies before the wedding. We've come too far to screw this up now." I pulled out my phone and started writing, my hands shaking as I recorded every word. "Backup plans are still life insurance policies, right?" she asked. "If anything goes wrong with the inheritance, Jake is worth $1.2 million in coverage, but the marriage route is easier. No investigations, no suspicious deaths to explain." I nearly dropped the phone. She was planning to kill my brother. After she hung up, I slipped into the spare room and waited for her to come out of the bathroom. When she finally emerged, she was back to her role as the sweet, caring girl, asking my mother if there was anything she could do to help with dinner. That night, I began my investigation in earnest. When Jake's college friends came over for his birthday, Meredith would disappear with sudden, debilitating migraines that required dark rooms and complete silence. But I caught her exploring his social media from the guest room, memorizing details about people she'd pretended she'd never met. She had spiral notebooks full of information, inside jokes, shared memories, awkward college stories, career details, family connections, everything she needed to appear like the perfect girlfriend who just happened to have never met his closest friends because of her chronic health issues. "I get so many headaches around large groups of people," she explained later, touching Jake's arm with mock affection. "All the fuss and energy just overloads my system. I'm so sorry I didn't get to know everyone properly." Jake felt guilty for inviting friends over, planning social events, living his life in a way that hurt his girlfriend. I found credit reports in her purse when she asked me to get her lip gloss out of her bag. Not just Jake, his entire family, including me and our parents. She had run comprehensive background checks on all of us, mapping out our financial situations like a military strategist planning an invasion. The reports were exhaustive, showing bank account numbers, credit scores, investment portfolios, property values, even our employment histories and salary ranges. The papers dated back 3 months to when she and Jake allegedly met casually at a coffee shop near his office. She was targeting him specifically. The most damning discovery came when I borrowed her laptop to print out wedding invitations, claiming my printer was broken. Her browser history was a model of manipulation and criminal planning. How to speed up your wedding timeline. Inheritance laws by state. How to get men to propose faster. Signs your boyfriend's family is rich. How to access your spouse's accounts after marriage. Symptoms of digital poisoning. How to make heart attacks look natural. Life insurance payout times. But the creepiest search was a recent one. How to induce heart attacks in elderly cancer patients without detection. I screenshot everything, my hands shaking as I documented months of calculated deception and what seemed like murder planning. For weeks, I collected evidence as if I were building a federal case. ID photos, wiretapped conversations, bank statements showing her mounting debts. She owed $47,000 on 7 credit cards and had 2 outstanding judgments totaling another $23,000. Her car was 3 months behind on payments and was scheduled for repossession. She had been evicted from 2 apartments in the last year for not paying rent. Jake was her lottery ticket, and she was running out of time. I discovered that she had been married twice before, both times to wealthy older men who had died under suspicious circumstances. The first husband, Harold Brennan, suffered a massive heart attack at 52, despite having no history of heart problems. The second, Robert Martinez, fell down the stairs at his home at 58, breaking his neck. Both deaths were ruled accidents after brief investigations, and both wives inherited everything: substantial life insurance policies, business assets, real estate portfolios. Meredith wasn't just a gold digger. She was a serial killer with a pattern. I tried to approach this carefully, sharing my concerns with my family at first, but Meredith was already positioning herself as a victim of my jealousy and mental health issues. When I mentioned her erratic work schedule, she confided to my mother that she had a severe anxiety disorder that made it difficult to hold down a regular job. When I questioned her financial contribution to their relationship, she tearfully explained to my father how her abusive ex-husband had destroyed her credit score out of spite and left her financially devastated. "I'm so ashamed of my situation," she sobbed to my parents. "Jake knows everything and still accepts me. But Sarah seems to think I'm some kind of gold digger just because I'm not rich like your family." For every concern I had, she followed up with a sympathetic explanation. She was always one step ahead, painting me as the unstable, jealous sister who couldn't handle her brother moving on. Jake was completely blind to all of this. Love has that effect on people, especially those who've been hurt before, he'd say when I voiced my concerns. For the first time since Sarah, I'm not afraid of being betrayed. Meredith's been through her own hell. She understands what it's like to have someone you trust hurt you. The irony was devastating. She was playing on his trauma, using his fear of being hurt again to make him ignore the signs that he'd been hurt in the same way. 2 weeks before the wedding, I made copies of everything and went to the police. Detective Morrison listened patiently as I laid out the evidence: records, financial documents, browser history, a diagram of dead husbands, but his expression grew more skeptical as I spoke. "Madam, being in debt is not a crime," he finally said. "Even researching inheritance laws is not illegal if she plans to marry into the family." As for the previous husbands, both cases were thoroughly investigated at the time. Without concrete evidence of an ongoing crime, it sounds like a family dispute. "She plans to kill my brother," I insisted, "and maybe my grandmother." "The phone call I recorded could be interpreted in many ways," he interrupted. "Defense lawyers are very good at creating reasonable doubt. Continuing to feign illness could mean a lot of things that aren't criminal." He was right legally, but I knew what I knew. "What if she actually did hurt someone?" I asked. "Then we'll investigate," he said. "But we can't arrest people for crimes they might commit based on internet searches and suspicious timing." The night before the wedding, I made one last desperate attempt to reach my brother. "Jake, we need to talk about Meredith. Please listen to me for 5 minutes before you say anything." He cut me off before I could begin, his face flushed with anger and the stress of the wedding. "I don't want to listen to this jealousy anymore," he said. "You've been trying to sabotage us since the beginning. Every time I'm happy, you find something wrong with it. Sarah poisoned you against the idea of me being in a relationship." "This isn't about Sarah and my feelings about your relationship. This is about Sarah," he exploded, his voice echoing through his apartment. "Do you think every woman would hurt me the way she did? Well, you know what? Meredith isn't Sarah. She loves me for who I am, not for what I have. She's been through hell herself and she's come out stronger." His words hurt because some of them were true. I'd been protective of him since the divorce. Maybe too much, but this was different. "Jake, she knows about Grandma's estate. She planned this marriage as a business deal." "That's enough." He stood up, towering over me. "If you can't support my happiness, if you can't see that I've found someone who genuinely cares about me, then maybe you shouldn't be at my wedding tomorrow." The threat hit like a physical blow. Jake and I had been inseparable as kids. He'd walk me to school when kids teased me about my thick glasses and thrift store clothes. I had helped him through his divorce, held him while he cried over Sarah's betrayal, and promised him that he would find true love someday. The thought of losing him to someone who planned to destroy him was unbearable. But I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I wore my bridesmaid dress, a soft lavender that Meredith had chosen because it looked beautiful in photographs and complemented her wedding pictures. I applied my makeup carefully, styled my hair in the elegant updo she had requested, and smiled during the pre-wedding photo shoot at her parents' house. I hugged Meredith and told her she looked absolutely stunning in her $8,000 designer dress, which Jake had insisted on paying for despite her protests. "You're going to make my brother very happy," I said. the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. I posed with the bridesmaids and made casual conversation about flowers and honeymoon plans, nodding excitedly as she described their planned 2-week trip to Italy, another expensive vacation that Jake was funding, all the while carrying the evidence folder carefully tucked into a specially made pocket inside my dress. The ceremony was at Riverside Country Club, Jake's dream wedding venue, one he'd talked about since he was a kid. 300 guests filled the elegant ballroom. Business delegates, college friends, distant relatives, and local community members who had known our family for decades. Meredith had insisted on the most expensive package: an open bar, a 7-course dinner, a live band, lush floral arrangements that cost more than most people's cars. Every detail was designed to impress people she would never see again after receiving the benefits. As I walked down the aisle in front of the bride, carrying a bouquet of white roses and lavender that matched my dress, I saw my grandmother in the front row. She looked heartbreakingly frail in her wheelchair, cancer treatments having taken much of her strength and nearly 40 pounds from her once robust frame. But her eyes were shining with joy as she watched her grandson's wedding, her face beaming with happiness that he had found love again. She had no idea she was watching her own murder plot unfold in real time. The officiant, Pastor Williams, who had known our family for 20 years, began the ceremony with a reading from Corinthians about how love is patient and kind. Jake stood at the altar, looking happier than I had seen him in years, his face alight with genuine joy as Meredith approached in her flowing white gown. She looked like a character from a fairy tale, which I suppose was the point. Dear ones, we are gathered here today to celebrate the union of Jacob Michael Sterling and Meredith Ann Collins in holy matrimony. Pastor Williams began, his warm voice carrying easily through the flower-filled ballroom. My heart pounded as he continued with the traditional ceremony. This is really happening. In a few minutes, my brother will be legally bound to a man who plans to kill him for money. A man who may have already killed 2 other men. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, conscientiously, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was ordained by God. It symbolizes the mystical union between Christ and his church, and therefore should not be undertaken thoughtlessly or selfishly, but thoughtfully and in the love of God. I thought about all the evidence hidden in my dress: credit reports showing her massive debts, browser history documenting searches for murder methods, a recorded phone call about keeping our grandmother sick, a chart of dead husbands who all died unexpectedly after marrying her. Would anyone believe me? Would it matter if they did? Marriage is a blessed order and institution, instituted by God in paradise, and confirmed to be honorable among all men. Therefore, it should not be entered into lightly or thoughtlessly, but reverently and in the fear of God. The irony of these words about a difficult marriage when looking at someone who had turned marriage into a murder weapon was not lost on me. If anyone can name a good reason why they cannot be united, let him say so now or forever hold his peace. The moment came faster than I expected. The traditional words that in today's world usually pass without incident, a formality that Pastor Williams had probably not seen interrupted in his decades of ministry. I stood slowly, my legs shaking with adrenaline and terror. I do. The church became so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. 300 people turned and stared at me. I felt their shock, their confusion, their condemnation, crashing over me in waves. Jake's face went white, then red with embarrassment and rage. Meredith's expression quickly changed to surprise, anger, and then settled into hurt confusion, her standard manipulation tactic. I object to this marriage, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet room despite my shaking hands. Jake stepped forward from the altar, his face a mask of humiliation and anger. Sarah, please sit down. This is completely inappropriate. I can't do this, I said, reaching for the folder hidden in my dress. Everyone needs to see this. Everyone needed to know what was really going on here. Meredith's eyes landed on the folder, like a predator spotting its prey. And for a second, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely. I saw a flash of pure, murderous hatred on her face before she collected herself and went into victim mode. I'm so sorry for everyone, she told the crowd, her voice shaking with practiced emotion, her eyes beginning to fill with tears. Jake's sister has been going through some serious personal issues lately. She was against our relationship from the start, and we'd tried to be understanding and supportive. A wave of sympathy swept through the guests. Several nodded knowingly, their faces filled with compassion for what they assumed was a family struggling with mental health issues. It was easier to believe that explanation than the truth. "Sarah's been in therapy," Jake added, trying to salvage the situation and minimize the embarrassment. "She's having a hard time accepting the fact that I've recovered from my divorce and found happiness again." I walked down the aisle, opening the folder and pulling out the first document. "Meredith, tell everyone about the phone call you had on Easter Sunday. The one where you discussed keeping our grandmother sick until the wedding so you could inherit the family business." The color drained from Meredith's face so quickly I thought she might faint, but she recovered with impressive speed. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, tears now flowing freely. "It's my wedding day. How could you do this to me?" "With your own brother?" "Because I have a recording," I said, pulling out my phone. "Want me to play it for everyone?" I pressed play, and her voice filled the silent church, crystal clear and unmistakably hers. "The wedding has to happen before his grandmother dies. This inheritance won't pass unless we're married. The lawyers were very clear about the prenuptial agreement. Just keep it 60-40, like we discussed." The room erupted in gasps, whispers, and shocked exclamations. I watched as faces changed from confusion to horror as the implications began to sink in. My grandmother clutched her chest, her face pale with realization and betrayal. Jake looked at Meredith as if he'd never seen her before, and in many ways, he hadn't. I don't," Meredith began. But I was already pulling out more evidence, laying papers out on the altar as if I were laying out a case for a jury. "Here are her credit reports showing $47,000 in active debt across several accounts," I announced, holding up the documents. "Here are her browser histories, documenting months of research into our family finances, inheritance laws, and murder methods. Here are records of her 2 previous marriages to wealthy men who both died under suspicious circumstances shortly after their weddings." I spread the papers across the altar, creating an irrefutable record of evidence that couldn't be explained away, or written off as jealousy. "You didn't meet her by chance, Jake," I continued, my voice growing stronger as I saw doubt creep into his eyes. "She's been stalking our family for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. You weren't her first target, and if this wedding had happened, you wouldn't have been her last." Jake picked up one of the credit reports with trembling hands, studying the numbers that told the story of Meredith's desperate financial situation. "Meredith, is this true? These debts? These dates?" She was trapped, her carefully crafted lies unraveling in real time in front of hundreds of people. But Meredith was a survivor who had honed her craft over years of deception, and survivors adapt quickly when pushed into a corner. "Okay, yeah," she said, abandoning her innocent facade entirely and speaking in a voice I'd never heard her use before. Cold, calculating, completely different from the sweet girl image. "I researched your family before we started dating, but in today's world, it just makes sense. Everyone does background checks on the people they plan to commit to. But that doesn't mean I don't love him." "You told us you'd never been married before," Jake said quietly, his voice hollow with betrayal. "I told you my last relationship didn't work out," she replied with a shrug. "Technically, that's true. Death is the ultimate failure of a relationship. 2 husbands died, Meredith. Both mysteriously, both rich, both shortly after marrying you." She actually laughed, a sound completely unlike any laugh she'd ever made in our family. It was harsh, bitter, and utterly without warmth. "Mysterious," she mimicked. "Harold died of a heart attack because he weighed 300 pounds and lived on bacon and whiskey. Robert fell down the stairs because he was drunk 20 hours a day and could barely stand up straight. If that's mysterious, every widow in America should be under investigation." The cold calculation in her voice, her carefree attitude toward the deaths of the men she claimed to love, was terrifying. That was who she really was beneath the sweet, vulnerable girl's facade, a predator who viewed human lives as business opportunities. My father stepped forward from the front row, his face red with anger. "Young lady, I think you should leave immediately." "I'm not going anywhere," Meredith snapped, her mask completely gone. "This is my wedding, and this is a lie spread by a jealous, mentally unstable woman who can't accept that her brother is moving on with his life." "Then explain the phone call," I challenged, picking up the phone again. Explain the plans to keep our grandmother sick until the wedding. Explain the discussion about dividing up Jake's inheritance with someone. For the first time in my entire life, Meredith didn't have an immediate answer. She glanced around the room, perhaps weighing her options or looking for an escape route, then seemed to make a decision. Okay, she said venomously, taking off her wedding ring and tossing it at Jake's feet, where it clicked onto the marble floor. You want to believe your psycho sister over me? Go ahead, but you're making the biggest mistake of your life. She started to walk toward the back of the church, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender. But she stopped at the door and turned back, her face contorted with rage. Jake, when you realize what you've lost, don't look for me, she snarled. And when your precious sister ruins every relationship you ever try to have because she can't stand to see you happy with someone, remember this moment. Remember that you chose her mental illness over my love. She walked out, and almost half the guests followed her. Some were supportive, others just wanted to see more drama in the parking lot or just wanted to get away from the awkward situation. Jake stood among the scattered papers, still holding her credit report, surrounded by the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of his life. His dream wedding had turned into a public nightmare in front of everyone he knew and respected. Jake, I said softly, approaching him carefully as if he might escape. I'm so sorry it happened this way, but don't... He raised his hand, his voice empty. Just don't say anything right now. I can't. I need a minute to process all of this. Pastor Williams, clearly shaken by the most dramatic ceremony of his career, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should move to a more private location. My parents, Jake, and I found ourselves in the country club manager's office, while the remaining guests were directed to the banquet room for drinks and whatever explanations the staff could provide. Jake sat in a leather chair, still in his tuxedo, staring at the evidence laid out on the mahogany table like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. How long have you known? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I started to suspect something over Easter when I overheard that phone conversation, but I've been actively collecting evidence for about 6 weeks. 6 weeks? He nodded slowly, as if trying to process a timeline that didn't match up with his reality. And you never thought to tell me that? I tried, I said, frustration dripping from my voice. Every time I brought it up, you said I was jealous or mentally unstable. You threatened to cut me from the wedding guest list when I tried to talk to you last night. My father picked up the recording device, turning it over in his hands. Son, this is pretty compelling evidence. That phone call alone suggests she was planning something terrible. I know what he's talking about. Jake's voice was flat, emotionless. I just need to figure out how I got this so wrong again. How do I keep choosing women who want to destroy me? His mother sat down next to him, her hand on his shoulder. Honey, it's not your fault. She's clearly a professional at this kind of manipulation. A professional? What? A con artist? A serial killer? How do I keep falling for people who see me as a target and not a person? The pain in his voice broke my heart. It was exactly what I'd been afraid of. That even saving him would somehow hurt him more. That exposing Meredith's deception would make him doubt his own judgment of everyone. You didn't choose this, I said firmly. She chose you. She scouted you, studied you, hunted you down, and manipulated you with surgical precision. Nothing about your relationship was real or accidental or based on your choice. Detective Morrison arrived an hour later. I had called him before the ceremony, asking him to be on standby in case my objection actually worked and we needed law enforcement assistance. He interviewed us all, took the evidence seriously, and made several calls to colleagues in other states. The deaths of her previous husbands are being reopened as active investigations, he told us after the calls ended. And we are looking into multiple charges of fraud related to the fake IDs she used to look into your family's finances and identity theft related to obtaining your credit reports. Fake IDs? Jake looked up, confused. Meredith Ann Collins is not her real name, Detective Morrison explained. Her name is actually Michelle Carter, and she has an extensive history of petty fraud that stretches back 15 years. Marriage fraud, credit card fraud, insurance claims, identity theft. She accumulated bigger targets as she refined her skills. Jake was silent for a long time after Detective Morrison left to coordinate with other agencies. Finally, he looked me straight in the eye. "I owe you the biggest apology of my life," he said. "Not just for today, but for the weeks you ignored my concerns and called me crazy." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "You're my brother. It's my job to protect you, even when I'm being a complete idiot who won't listen to reason, especially back then." We spent the rest of the evening at the hotel bar, still in our wedding clothes, getting increasingly drunk as Jake processed the reality of his near debacle. Some of the wedding guests joined us, curious about the dramatic turn of events and wanting to make sure Jake was okay. By midnight, it had become an oddly celebratory gathering, more a celebration of a bullet dodged than a celebrated wedding. "You know what the worst part is?" Jake said around 1 a.m., loosening his bow tie and looking more relaxed than he had in months. I actually thought I was getting better at judging people. After Sarah, I promised myself I'd be more careful, more alert, more aware of the warning signs. Instead, I chose someone even worse. "Sarah was a traitor and a thief," I pointed out. "But she didn't plan to kill you for the insurance money. There's a significant difference in the level of evil we're talking about." "Yes, one is more creative than the other," he said with dark humor. Our cousin David, who had stayed for the impromptu reception, raised his glass. To Sarah, who saved Jake's life and likely his inheritance. To families that don't give up on each other, even when it's hard. To families that don't give up on each other, even when it's hard, Jake corrected, clinking his glass against mine. 3 weeks later, Detective Morrison called with big news. Meredith Michelle was arrested in Las Vegas while attempting to marry a casino owner using yet another fake ID. Investigations into her previous husbands found evidence of digitalis poisoning in both cases, a plant toxin that mimics the symptoms of a heart attack and is nearly undetectable without special testing. She faced multiple charges of first-degree murder, fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft in 4 states. Jake changed the locks and hired a private security company after receiving multiple threatening phone calls from an unknown number that we all assumed were Meredith calling from jail. He also began therapy with a trauma and manipulation therapist to address what he called his broken choices in relationships. "I need to understand why I'm attracted to people who want to hurt me," he told me after our first session. "There must be something I'm missing, some pattern I'm not seeing." 6 months later, our grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her loving family. Jake had inherited the family business, as was destined, but more importantly, he was alive to receive it and honor her memory. At her funeral, he squeezed my hand during the service. "She would have been heartbroken to know what almost happened," he whispered. "She would have been proud that family protected family," I whispered back. A year later, Jake began dating Emma, a 3rd-grade teacher at an elementary school near his home. She was kind, genuine, financially independent, and had her own career and life goals. More importantly, when Jake told her what had happened to Meredith, she was horrified rather than impressed, which seemed like a great sign for his recovery. "I'm going to need you to check her out, too," Jake joked the first time he brought Emma to Sunday dinner. "Have you done a background check yet?" I replied with a smile. "Clean credit, steady employment for 6 years, no mysterious dead husbands, and she insisted on paying for her own coffee on your first date. Are you okay?" "Did you really run a background check?" Emma asked, laughing. "After what happened? I run background checks on everyone who comes within 10 feet of me," I said. "It's not personal." "It's completely personal," Emma said. "And I respect that. Family is supposed to protect family. For me, I've learned that sometimes protecting your loved ones means risking their anger, their resentment, even their relationship with you. I've learned that family loyalty isn't just supporting someone else's choices. Sometimes it's refusing to support them when their choices are dangerous, even if that refusal hurts in the short term. And I've learned that standing up in front of 300 people and ruining a wedding is both the scariest and most necessary thing I've ever done in my life." Jake and Emma got engaged last Christmas. They're planning a small ceremony next spring, just immediate family and close friends at my parents' house. Jake asked me to be his best man instead of a traditional bridesmaid. "I need someone who will speak up if something doesn't feel right," he said when he asked. "Always," I promised. That's what family is for. Meredith Michelle was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of fraud in 4 states. She's serving life without parole in a maximum security correctional facility. All of her appeals have been denied. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had kept quiet that day. If I had let the wedding happen and hoped for the best. If I had chosen to avoid conflict rather than cause a scene. But then I look at my brother, alive and happy and in a healthy relationship with someone who genuinely loves him for who he is. And I know I made the right choice. Family protects family, even when it's messy and awkward and humiliating, even when it means standing at the altar and ruining everything in front of hundreds of people, even when it costs you temporary relationships and social standing. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let someone you care about destroy themselves, even if they hate you for it in the moment.